We're talking about freedom today. That's an enormous topic. And so as we begin to poke around and explore this complicated concept from many points of view, I invite you to start with your own. And I invite you to do this. Take a moment and in your mind's eye, with your eyes open or closed as you prefer, ask yourself, who embodies freedom for me? When I think of freedom, who is it? Whose face, whose name, whose life comes before me to say freedom? Where is freedom located? Do you have someone? Could be someone you know, could be a famous person, could be a kind of person, not even a particular person, but who embodies freedom for you? And then think about, what is it about them that says freedom? What is it about them? What are they free from? How are they using freedom? How are they using their life? What makes them say freedom to you? And as you think about them, I invite you to consider this. Is there something they could teach you about an area of your life where you're not feeling free? Did you think of them because they embody something you don't feel about freedom? Or did you think of them because they embody what you do feel, only maybe more of it? Or maybe you thought of yourself. I want to hear about that if that's true. There are so many ways that we're not free. It's such a big conversation. Just for instance, within the Church of the Larger Fellowship, more than 500 of our members are in jail. They are physically not free. They are not free in so many ways, and yet in other ways they're finding freedom. And later in this service, you'll hear a few minutes of reflection from Chaplain Patty, who works with those prisoners, about what she's learned from them about freedom. I know it's always humbling for me when I get letters from them, and they write a lot. They have a lot of time, for one thing. That's one thing they do have, which for many of us, one of the kinds of tyranny we don't get to experience. We don't get to have that free time. And they do. They're, many of them, very actively pursuing their spiritual lives with their time. And they do write a lot of wonderful letters. And every time I get a letter from them, they remind me, not because it's what they say, but because they're writing for their own context, they remind me of the freedoms that I absolutely take for granted every day. The freedom to go outside and breathe fresh air, even if it's cold. The freedom to talk to people when I want to talk to them. And the freedom to have privacy, which is a huge freedom. You know, in 1941, Franklin Roosevelt, the president in the US, gave a speech called the Four Freedoms speech, where he laid out 4 freedoms. And those are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. And those 4 freedoms were then put into the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations that Eleanor Roosevelt helped to found. She really took those 4 freedoms and wanted to move them even more deeply into the world. Think about any of those 4 freedoms and how incredibly complicated they are. Freedom of religion. Are there limits to that? You know, like, what about religions that really oppress people? Is that a religious freedom, to be oppressive to people? Freedom of speech. What about speech that's really hateful? All of these freedoms, there's a balancing that needs to come with care for the rest of the world. Freedom from fear, you know, that could be the need to live in a government that doesn't make you afraid, or it could be about your own home, which for many women and children is the most dangerous place they ever go. And freedom from want. Freedom from want. What about those of us who are so privileged that, you know, I really want the new iPhone? Is that the kind of freedom from want that should be enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights? Or is there also a limit to that, and there should be a freedom from getting too much? So freedom is a really complicated concept that I think always has to be balanced with responsibility, accountability. In the Unitarian Universalist statement of who we are, it says we believe in a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Those two words together, how does freedom balance responsibility, and how does responsibility balance freedom? I'm aware as I think about this community of all the ways that you are struggling with a sense of loss of freedom. I talk to people with a partner who has dementia, who really can't leave their house without being afraid of what that person might do, who really are feeling actually as if they're on house arrest. I talk to people who have physical or mental disabilities that keep them from being able to participate in the world, and a world that doesn't seem to value them because of that, and the sense of lack of freedom that that brings. I think about all of the struggles for justice, for legal freedom, for, the struggle that we're going through right now around immigration in the United States, and who's really free to cross what border, and who's free to impose borders on other people. Or the struggle to decide who's free to be married, who can claim relationship to each other, who has that kind of freedom. Freedom's a big conversation. I think when I center down into it spiritually, there are two ways that it plays out. One is the kind of freedom I want, the individual freedom, the freedom to be exactly who I am authentically and to live. And the other is a freedom that's more about a people being free, not me getting every single tiny bit of what I want, but really balancing that with what other people need. If you look at writings about freedom, people who are oppressed, when they use the word freedom, they're often talking about a people being free, not so individual. And liberation theology, which is theology really grounded in God's desire that people are free, liberation theology, which comes out of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, is really about the people being free, the people together, God's people. And later in the month, when we talk about Passover, that is kind of the central holiday, talking about the people going from slavery to freedom. That's not about Moses, particularly, specifically himself being liberated. In fact, Moses is like, I don't want to lead these people, Lord. Find someone else. But no, that's Moses's freedom is completely bound up with everyone else. So there's the freedom of the people, and there's the freedom of the individual, and sometimes these are in conflict with each other. There's a book that Paul Razor, a theologian, has written where he talks about the difference between liberal theology and liberation theology. And he says that liberal theology is much more about individualism and individual freedom. So as we think about freedom, and I invite you to think back to the person that you called up, was it a person who really embodied this kind of individual freedom? I tend to think of babies, for instance, being really free. They're completely free from shame. They're completely free to just be exactly who they are. Or sometimes you see old people who just don't care anymore. My grandmother was like that. At the end, she just said, live with it. And she just was absolutely who she wanted to be. She was not bound by worrying about what other people thought. There's that kind of freedom. And then there's the kind of freedom that, the freedom riders together were creating freedom for their people. So who did you think of when you thought about freedom? And that might tell you some about where your own struggle for freedom is located. I'm glad that we have 5 weeks to do this. I'm glad that we have a few major holidays to pull in on it, because both Easter and Passover are about freedom. The freedom in the resurrection, the freedom in the people's struggle. And I'm glad that you're here too, because what I see is that my freedom, what I am struggling with, is sometimes so particular to me, and to hear other people talk often can remind me to be grateful, to be incredibly grateful for all the ways that I do have freedom. Not just the letters from the prisoners, which obviously make me grateful for freedoms, but also communication with so many other people who are struggling. When my child sometimes says, "Why do I have to struggle with this and no one else seems to?" I say, you know, we're all struggling with something. We're all in some kind of prison trying to get out. And so I hope this is a community where we can unlock doors for each other and that together we can help each other to find freedom.